Okay, thank you for coming. We're going to move on to our second speaker. So we have a concise but I think beautiful set of speakers today who show the breadth of neuroscience from the simplest of input stimuli, photons, and how you collect them and interpret them, to one of the most interesting and complex outputs of the brain, morality. And to introduce our next speaker, I'm going to introduce Mike Paradiso, another colleague of mine from the Department of Neuroscience. He's a Fox Professor of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences, and a first-class neuroscientist. And I'm going to give the floor to Mike.
All right. Introduce the introducer.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Churchland, who's the President's Professor of Philosophy at UCSD. Dr. Churchland is very much a U.S.-Canadian sort of fusion. After my understanding, growing up in the wilds of British Columbia, her education, training, and her academic positions have been in both countries over the years. But for the past, several decades, I guess, she's been at University of California at San Diego, and why leave there? One of my earliest recollections of her work was in a book she published in the late 1980s, and it was simply called Neurophilosophy, and it was subtitled Toward a Unified Science of the Mind-Brain. And it was the first time I ever heard the term neurophilosophy. I don't know how old it is, actually, but as the name implies, it's research at the intersection of neuroscience and philosophy. And I guess, simplistically, the way I see this is that I assume most neuroscientists, most brain scientists are materialists, and not being a philosopher, I simply mean by that we think that the mind, consciousness, that everything we do, in the end, is just based on physical elements that obey the laws of physics, and there's nothing it is magical what happens, but there's nothing magical, no ether or spirit that is more to it. It comes from these elements. And so if that's true, the conclusion of that is that if you study the mind and if you study the brain and learn enough about its structure and its function, in the end, you should be able to learn something about the mind and these higher capabilities. And Dr. Churchland has very much been a leader and a pioneer in this research for several decades. And nowadays there are people at Brown that do things I would call neurophilosophy, and at many places around the world. Her research has examined things like consciousness and morality, as Barry said, things as specific, from what I see, as the effects of oxytocin on behavior. And I'm not sure if everyone's read her papers, but fortunately over the years, for those of us who didn't take college philosophy, she's published a fair number of books on the subject and tried to bring together these fields. One is the old book that I mentioned on neurophilosophy. An early one that I remember also was called The Computational Brain, that she wrote together with Terry Sosnowski from the Salk Institute, which tried to bring together neuroscience very early on and explain how you might get networks of neurons to accomplish higher brain function, really, things like perception and memory. And in her most recent book, I think Touching a Nerve is your most recent book, isn't it? Yeah. It's an attempt to reconcile, as I understand it, philosophy of mind with science from high altitude. For the innovative research that she's conducted, she's won numerous awards and honorary degrees over the years. She's a member of the International Academy of Humanism, a MacArthur Award recipient, and she's on the executive boards of various philosophy societies. One note I saw in looking at her CV, which I was shocked was not there, and I assume was the pinnacle of your career, was appearing on the Colbert Report on TV. And if any of you have seen this, there's some laughs, so some of you surely have seen this show. She held her own quite well, I would say, against a tough opponent who, no matter how good you are, he wants to be your opponent. So I remember him Bible thumping and the whole thing. It was quite fun. One other personal note, I guess, is that there's something going on at the Churchland household, in the water or the espresso or whatever. As I'm sure many of you know, her husband is also a famous neurophilosopher. They're a team. Her son, Mark, is a professor at Columbia who studies brain circuits and movement. Her daughter, Anne, is faculty, a researcher at Cold Spring Harbor. She has her own lab that studies neural circuits and decision-making. And I got to think about this because I've known Mike Shadland for a long time, and Mike Shadland was a undergraduate at Brown who we used to interact with many, many years ago, Leon and I, and he was a medical student at Brown. And so in this sort of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of way, Pat is at most 1 or 2 degrees away from Brown because Ann was a postdoc with Mike Shadland and he was a Brunonian, so you're almost a Brunonian. So welcome, and thank you very much for coming. The title of our talk today is Nerve Agents, You and Your Amazing Old-Fangled Reward System. So thank you, Pat.
Well, thanks so much, and I'm sorry that I have actually missed much of this really wonderful meeting. For various complicated reasons, I wasn't able to get here until yesterday, but it's really quite extraordinary to think that Brown has been doing these wonderful things for 250 years, and we wish Brown great future success for the next 250. Now, what I want to talk about today is morality, and what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about my explorations that have come about over the last decade or so. And the question that really has motivated me is one that's very old and has motivated many people, most famously, of course, Socrates. And the question is, where do our moral values, where do our moral values come from? And in a number of the early dialogues, Socrates wrestles with these things, and of course, his various interlocutors try to give him answers, and they're all hopelessly wrong, as Socrates then goes on to show. And so it remains a very difficult and important question. I should also just preface my opening comments by saying that I'm going to draw a really very large panoramic picture here. And so that means that much of the detail will have to either wait for discussion or perhaps we can communicate in other ways. I have one data slide, but that's really it. And so what I want to do is to sort of give you the big picture. Some of you will know some parts of it better than other parts of it, but I am going to move fairly quickly. Now, I want to begin with this slide by saying that given what we know about evolutionary biology, we understand quite well what it is for a physical structure to contain the circuitry of value. It's not a surprise. Now, the most fundamental kind of value is that value that has the organism seeing to its own needs in order that it survive and reproduce. Failing to be accomplished in those areas, failing to succeed as at the 4 F's, as Paul MacLean called them, the feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. Failing those means that you don't reproduce, your genes are not passed on, and so if you don't have the circuitry to see to your own needs, then you're not going to pass anything on to the offspring. And we understand really quite well what that means, for you to have self-oriented values. And I want to start that way because sometimes people think that the very idea of value and the brain is an odd mixture, that they are immiscible, that they don't sort of come together. But clearly, with regard to the most fundamental value, they absolutely do. With regard to social values or moral values, many evolutionary biologists have been puzzled about how they could emerge in the course of evolution. And in his first book, Richard Dawkins says that they really couldn't, because were there to be a mutation for altruistic behavior, almost certainly the other selfish organisms would take advantage of that altruism, and eventually the gene for altruism would fail to be passed on. And so in the selfish gene, Dawkins suggests that in one way or another, morality has to be learned and imposed on us because we are not naturally disposed. Now, I think he's actually changed his mind a bit on that, but that was the early view. Now, it's very interesting, actually, that Darwin himself took a very different view. And in his book, The Descent of Man, published in 1871, Darwin asked the question, where does our moral sense or our conscience come from? And that really is our question. And he suggested that there were three components to it. And the first one is social instinct. We have an instinct to be social. And he thought this was true of other mammals and of birds. Secondly, he said the important thing is the acquisition of the appropriate habits or skills. And finally, there must be a capacity for problem solving. For, as Vince Crawford might say, for solving coordination problems or for figuring out conventions and practices that work well within a social group. So Darwin, of course, could not know very much about molecular biology, and he could not know what in the brain might be relevant or might be supporting or regulating social instincts. But we actually have the advantage of understanding at least a little bit more. I included here the names Aristotle, David Hume, and Adam Smith because, like Darwin, they highlighted these three things as being the essential components for sociality. And like Darwin, and I think this is fundamentally correct too, they saw morality and sociality as really part of a single continuum. And so there may be, as it were, minor conventions and practices like not licking your knife at table on one end, and very serious things on the other end, like not torturing people just for the sheer fun of it, or maybe for any reason, at the other end. But there isn't a sharp distinction from the point of view of nature or from the point of view of the brain. Now, I want to have a couple of digression slides, and this is the first. And it's important for several reasons, which I'll come to. But on the vertical axis, what you can see are years in millions, and what you can see horizontally is spatial spread. And what is depicted on this slide, it's slightly dated because the Denisovans are not on this, but what is depicted are a number of species of humans. We are here too, we Homo sapiens. We're up here. And we have been around on the planet, it is believed, for about 250 to 300,000 years. Quite a long time. And Homo erectus, one of my favorite kinds of humans, was on the planet for 1.8 million years and seems to have disappeared. It's important, I think, to bear in mind that these are humans. They walked upright. They had opposable thumbs. Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalis certainly used fire, had stone tools. They may have engaged in various kinds of trade between groups. And Homo erectus appears to have built rafts out of logs that they lashed together with vines, and they got themselves out of Africa and into Indonesia. Now, until the advent of agriculture, about a mere 10,000 years ago, people would have lived in small hunter-gatherer groups from about 20 to maybe 100 or 150 people. And almost certainly, given what we know from current anthropology about hunter-gatherer groups, they had the fundamentals of social and moral behavior in the sense that there was probably food sharing, there was probably cooperative hunting, taking care of orphans, dealing with problems and conflicts, and so forth in the course of everyday life and everyday business. We know this, for example, about the Inuit as they lived in their typical situations in the Arctic. And so morality, at least morality as it deals with the fundamental features of human existence, almost certainly typified all of these groups. Just so that you know, of course, the Australopithecines predated the appearance of Homo, of human species. And our last common ancestor with the chimpanzee was about 5 million years ago, just so that you have a clear picture. Oh, and I think it's rather nice, actually, that Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapiens overlapped in time about 30,000 years. And if you go to the National Geographic website, they will send you a kit that will allow you to swab your cheek, and you can send the swab back in. And I was happy to discover, when they returned my data, that my genome is 4.9% Neanderthal, which means that, of course, there was, as we now know, interbreeding. All right. Now, we don't really see the advent of religion, of organized religion, until well after agriculture. And that probably has to do with the fact that when groups are small, and this is true if you've lived in a small town, everybody knows everybody else. And you don't want to besmirch your reputation, so when you are watched, there are many things impulses that you are apt to suppress. As groups become much larger, that sort of stability breaks down. You don't have the same moral suasion one over the other. And not everybody knows everybody else. And under those circumstances, it may have actually been fairly useful to have a kind of religion where it was suggested that even when you're not seen by people in the village, there is nevertheless an unseen presence who does know what you're doing. Having said that, though, it's very important to realize that not only did morality of a very important kind sustain itself over hundreds of thousands of years in Homo sapiens groups, but even when religion did appear, some religions, especially those in Asia, did not expect that morality came from a divine power. And that in the case of philosophers such as Mencius and Confucius, the idea was not that they themselves were divine. It was not that there was a divine source of morality and moral principles and ways of doing things. Rather, it was that this is something that can come about through reflection, understanding, and drawing upon this basic instinct for sociality. And I mention this because it is often supposed in the wider community that religion is somehow essential for morality. And that clearly is not the case. All right. I'm also going to do a couple of very fast slides just to give you a quickie, very quickie introduction to the philosophical traditions as we know them, more or less, at least in the West. Now, this is a simplification because there are, of course, many subtleties, God knows, but there are really two models. One is essentially a legal model. It says that the principles of morality are like, but deeper than and more basic than, the principles that are codified within the context of, for example, the criminal law. It's like that. And Moses certainly thought that, Kant thought that, Aquinas, and Bentham. And I'll say a little bit about Kant and Bentham. Now, a very different model, and I'm sorry to say it's a very messy model, but it's probably more accurate, as life is in biology, whether it's the biology of the retina or the biology of social life, is a skill model. And it basically says, very much like what Darwin said, which is that we have social instincts. So we have a fundamental motivation to be social. But then in addition to that, we acquire skills and habits, both from the group in which we live, but also by virtue of reflection. Confucius certainly thought that, as did Aristotle and the others. So I'll say just one or two quick things about Kant and then about the utilitarians. Now, Kant then did have a sort of legal model, and he got his insight, interestingly, actually, from Hume. Because one place in Hume, Hume makes this comment that, of course, when you have rules, they should apply to everybody. You shouldn't be able to excuse yourself from a rule on grounds that you're you. I'm me, I'm special. I should be able to drive on the left-hand side if I want. Right? You shouldn't be able to do that. And he didn't make too much more of it. He just said, you have to have an appropriate excuse, and it can't be just that you're you and you're wonderful. Kant seems to have thought that if you took this idea of it should apply to everybody, that by mere logic, without any motivational or emotional aspect to it, you should be able to get the basic kernel of the nature of morality. And his idea was that mere logic is going to give it to you. So as long as the rule you're interested in is rationally universalizable, then it's morally correct. This came unstuck pretty fast, and anybody who ever teaches freshman philosophy knows that it comes unstuck very fast, because somebody's always going to say, yeah, but there's going to be somebody who says, I think it's right to kill all red-haired people, especially if they're Irish. And if I were a red-haired Irish person, it should apply to me too. So universally, it's universalizable, it applies to me too, so what? And that, of course, is a refutation of the idea that it comes out of mere logic alone. There is more to be said about that. I wish there were a lot more that is deep and profound. I don't think so. On the other hand, following Kant, Henry Sidgwick and Jeremy Bentham had the idea still that they wanted a rule. And they thought that since humans are better off when they're not suffering than when they're suffering, better off when they're happy than when they're not, that we could make a universal rule applicable to all people under all conditions at all times. And the rule just says, maximize aggregate utility. And here again, freshmen rip this to shreds. And I'm sure you can sit there and think of the kinds of problems that arise here. Now, notice that this is not just saying that the consequences matter. Of course the consequences matter. Aristotle knew that. Hume and Smith knew that. It's saying that maximize aggregate utility for any decision you might make. And that means, for example, that I cannot prefer the health and welfare of my own children or on my own family to 20 orphans on the other side of the world, amongst other things. And that will quickly get you thinking about the kinds of difficulties here that there are. And of course, what counts as a utility for a given individual is going to vary. I know people who really, really like cage fighting. That's what they enjoy. And they might think that I'd enjoy that too. And so in order to maximize aggregate utility, they arrange for me to be in a cage and so forth. And that's not actually going to work for me. All right. So let's get back then to the skill model. And the legal model does apply and does work actually quite well where you think it would in a legal context. Where it doesn't work very well is understanding in a more deep sense where our moral convictions about what should be a law, where those convictions come from. Okay. Now, in the last probably 15 to 20 years, there have been so many extraordinary developments, not just in neuroscience, but elsewhere, that I think have given us a really important perspective on how to think about the nature of social life in mammals and in birds. And one group of people have been the researchers who have studied non-human social behavior. Another domain, of course, is within neuroscience, where neuroendocrinologists have helped us understand how very specific neurochemicals can regulate up, down, or change social behavior. And I'll say something about that. Especially within the last 15 years, the understanding of the subcortical structures, the basal ganglia and ancillary structures like the amygdala, have helped us understand the nature of skill learning and how motivation and skill learning and habit learning have to be integrated in order to get a kind of behavior that is really well suited to a particular condition. Genetics and brain evolution have really changed in many ways how we think about the capacities of primates and in particular the capacities of humans. And it's much easier now, I think, in the light of the data from brain evolution, to see links to to much earlier kinds of nervous systems that help us understand the shape and organization of our own. And finally, I think one really important thing that I won't be able to talk about has to do with planning and the fact that those guys who worked on the hippocampus, and in particular Matt Wilson and Bruce McNaughton, discovered this really amazing thing, and that is that rats, sometimes in waiting to make a choice, will rehearse the series of steps needed to get from where they are to where the goodies are. And we know that they do that because we are recording from cells in their hippocampus that respond to very particular places. So the rat will be sitting at a choice point, and you can see compressed in time the series of activation patterns that show he's thinking about going here, and he's thinking, yeah, that's where the goodie is. And that's a rat. And so when people are very skeptical about consciousness, I think we should kind of start thinking about rats and their offline predictions.
Now, I have to ask now.
Yes?
Do they do counterfactuals?
Oh, yeah, well, some animals can do counterfactuals. Yes, indeed, they can. And we know actually where to look for the counterfactual signal, and it's in the basal ganglia. Yeah, and Reed Montague is the one who's done the work. All right, not on rats, he hasn't, but on humans, but other people, yeah. Okay. So let me just say a few things about non-human social behavior. Now, many of you will know of the work of really wonderful and careful and thorough ethologists who have looked at non-human animal behavior both in captivity but also in the field. And this is not made up. This is consolation behavior. And it was this kind of behavior that really motivated Frans de Waal in the beginning to think that the social behavior of chimpanzees and probably other primates as well was not unlike our own. So he saw reconciliation behavior after conflicts. One guy loses, he goes to his friend, and they do that sort of thing. Consolation. Pro-social choice is very common, and the tests for it are very clean. Of course, there are lots of anecdata, but that's not good enough. So the test for this is like this. The monkey is here, and his pal is here. You give him an option of getting a goodie for himself or getting a goodie for each. And almost invariably, he makes the pro-social choice, which means he is sensitive to the desires or the fact that, in some respect, the fact that his friend is there. In the wild, orphan adoption has been seen by Chris Besch. In the Ngorongoro Reserve, he has seen 5 distinct instances of male chimpanzees adopt orphans when the mother died or was killed. And you might be thinking, yeah, but I bet they're biologically related. It was the biological father. So what they did was they collected urine samples of both the babies and the adoptive fathers. Not exactly a fun business, but it can be done. And it turned out they were not the biological fathers. Not that the male chimpanzees would necessarily have known that, but at least we knew that. We also see many instances of empathy. We know of instances of punishment for behavior that destabilizes the group. We know of lots of instances of cooperation, not just in primates, but of course most famously in the case of wolves. And we see instances of reasoning. I must just tell you, too, because you can see this on YouTube. So Peggy Mason, who is at Chicago, was interested in whether or not rats might show altruistic behavior. So she has this big space, and she gets a plexiglass trap, and she stuffs one rat in it. And his cage mate is then allowed to go into the space. And meanwhile, he's in there sort of going, let me out. And now, the rat who comes in, first of all, has to overcome the disinclination to be in an open field. Because, rats like to hug the wall. So that's thing one. The second thing is he has to overcome emotional contagion. So when one animal is fearful, it's very reflexive for the other animal to have a sudden jump of fear as well. So he's got to overcome that, and he does. And he goes over, and he tries to help, and he tries to help. There is a way of doing it. And eventually, he's taken out because he wasn't successful. Next day, he gets it. He goes over, and he's fiddling, and he's fiddling, and he's fiddling, and finally the rat comes out because the door is open. And they are so happy. They are with each other. They are almost like two dogs who've been apart and are suddenly together. All right, you think, so notice that he's spending effort and time releasing the animal. So here comes the final test. So then Peggy stuffs the friend in and puts some chocolate chips over here. The pal is allowed into the area. He first of all, oh, that's interesting. And then he goes to the rat that's in the plexiglass cage, releases it, and they both go and get the chips. Now that's quite interesting because many of us would have thought that rats are essentially and irreversibly selfish. Now maybe he's a well-fed rat and it doesn't hurt that much. I mean, I don't know. But it's a very interesting result. Okay, so that's just by way of saying that there is now a lot of very, very classy research on animal behavior that suggests, in the case of birds and mammals, that social behavior is very complicated, very complex, and goes across many different species. Here I'm just going to say a couple of very quick things about reasoning, just to give you the flavor. So I'm doing this kind of fast. So in this study, there is a crow in a cage, and there are 3 cups. And a treat is put in the right cup. And then it's pushed in, and he has to make a decision. So he's first of all taught, this will be the sample, this will be the test, and this will be the test. So he's taught if he picks this, he gets a goodie. And then here, if he chooses this, he gets a goodie. Here, if he chooses this, he gets a goodie. Now, notice here, there is nothing to which the sample is identical, but something to which it is analogous. Is the crow dumbfounded? No. The crow cocks his head and goes there. All right? So he's doing a slightly more abstract task. He's reasoning by analogy, two the same to two the same, and so he's not picking this. And similarly down here, here's the sample, 2 that are different, and so he goes here. Easily done by a crow, and by your faces I see that some of you are not finding it so easy. It's morning time. You may not be fully caffeinated. Oh, so that just shows you the setup. And here is a slightly different one. And again, the gray will give you the test condition. Sample is here. So it's green and blue. So that's the right answer. Here, that's the right answer. And here, then, what does he have to do? Well, here, they are the same color. These are not, this one is not red and yellow, but it is different. So different shapes, different colors is the right answer. The crow has no trouble seeing that that's where the goodie is. They do it spontaneously. They do not have to be trained. This was done by a Russian group in Wasserman's lab. Okay. So now I want to say a little bit about neuroendocrinology. That just gives you a fast feel for a tiny taste of some of the work that's been done by the ethological researchers in studying various aspects of behavior that are relevant to social behavior. And so neuroendocrinology. And I'm not going to say very much about birds just because we're short of time, but that can come up in the question period because it's a really interesting story. All right. So sometime about 220 or so million years ago, there emerged warm-blooded animals. Probably the first were warm-blooded reptiles. And as you will imagine, that gives them a great advantage because it means that they can hunt at night when the sun is down. They might even predate on things that are sleeping at night because they can't move. And it also means that they can hunt further afield in colder climates and live there. So it is a great advantage, but the great disadvantage concerns energy. And that is gram for gram, you have to eat 10 times as much if you're a warm-blooded animal as if you were a cold-blooded animal. So that means that there is going to be a tremendous advantage to good hunters. And good hunters usually means that you're crafty, that you're able to plan into the future, that you're able to understand the causal mechanisms of the world that you happen to be placed into. Now, a good way to do that, if you're Mother Nature, is to have the young born very immature, if I may speak anthropomorphically. So have the young born very immature, and then have the neurons expand and tune themselves up to whatever environment you happen to find yourself into. And that looks like a much faster and more efficient way than trying to build every contingency into the genome. And we think that basically something like that is what happened, although needless to say, just how that all worked out is not well understood. But what you can see is then that there is a kind of trade-off between being mature at birth and having a great learning capacity. And one of the things that seems to also have happened is the neocortex emerged as a result of there being many, many more neurons put into play. And the cortex, as you know, is just that little purple bit on the outside. And you know that it has this very highly structured, highly organized circuitry. But babies, when they're born, have a complement of neurons, but very, very little in the way of processes of dendritic branching and axonal branching. And what happens is over time, as the brain tunes itself up to its both causal and social environment, we see a tremendous growth. So in humans, from infancy to adulthood, there is growth in weight of about a factor of 5. It's estimated, or at least Pierre Changeux tells me, that there are about 10 million synapses appearing per second in the first year of life. So there's tremendous growth. But of course, as you also, I'm sure, know, that there is some pruning back around 2 to 3 years, And in adolescence, about 11, 12, 13, there is also streamlining and pruning back that in some way that is not understood allows for a much more efficient brain. Now, that's all very well, of course, but if you have dependent offspring and your mother nature, you have this very difficult situation. You've got to get them old enough. I mean, it's all very nice that their brains are going to tune themselves up, but how are you going to get them to that stage before they're eaten? And the answer seems to have been, in both birds and mammals, to reorganize very old parts of the brain and to reorganize them in such a way that the mother or the father or both care for the offspring in the way that they care for themselves. So you take that old self-regarding circuitry that we talked about at the beginning, and you rig it so that the mother's responses to the offspring are like her own responses to fear, to threat, to cold, and to hunger. And one way to do that, of course, is to make her feel pain under certain circumstances where the infants are hungry or cold or threatened. And the infants help out by another new invention, and that is separation vocalization. The rat falls out of the nest. It squeals like crazy. This causes pain in the mother. The mother gets the pup, puts it back in the nest. They both feel good. What did that circuitry involve? Well, there's much that we don't know, but we think we know at least some parts of the story. Oxytocin and its sibling peptide, vasopressin, appear to be very important in regulating the bonding of mother to offspring and offspring to mother. And so when there is cuddling and nurturing, or in the case of rats, the mother rat is suckling the pups, there is oxytocin released both in the brain of the mother and in the brain of the infants. And this turns out to be extremely important in providing a support for their feeling tightly bonded to each other. Oxytocin is only part of the story. There are many other parts involved, but most particularly the endogenous opioids, those opioids that your own brain makes. And so part of why you feel good with oxytocin is that oxytocin and stress hormones operate somewhat like this in opposition. So you're feeling good partly because the stress hormones are down, but you're also feeling good because the mu receptors for the opioids are full of opioids. And that makes you feel good. All right. So the hypothalamus, just to remind you, because I realize not all of you are neuroscientists, is a very ancient part of the brain that regulates many important functions, including feeding and aggression. But it also releases oxytocin, and here is a kind of blow-up of it. It releases oxytocin in mammals and in birds into very specific parts of the brain. It also releases it into the pituitary, which then releases it into the bloodstream. So you also have oxytocin in many parts of your body. All right. So the summary point here, then, is that we're beginning to understand sociality in its kind of platform in a very different way. We start off with me, and now we've got me and mine. And my care for and this is a monumental change in the history of biological evolution. We do see sociality in insects and in fish, but it lacks the complexity. It lacks the voluntary aspect, the flexibility that we see in birds and that we see in all mammals. All right. So the hypothesis, then, is that sociability turns out to be a basic value for mammals, at least this kind of sociality. And I'll have to talk a bit more about it. That the hub is oxytocin and the opioids, but other things are critical too. Of course, dopamine, of course, serotonin. And then there's the question of norms, because we know that even in hunter-gatherer societies such as the Inuit of the Arctic, they may have all kinds of conventions and practices that they follow that make for the prosperity and stabilization of the group. They're not always articulated, but the children follow them. Everybody follows them pretty much. And the question is, what's the status of the norms? What does the brain do about the norms? Okay. So I want now to take us beyond mother-infant to others. What about mates? What about kin? What about friends? And the starting point of the story is, of course, the prairie voles. And as you know, the prairie voles are unlike montane voles in the respect that for many of them, but by no means all, once they mate, they tend to be bonded for life. And what that means is that they like to stay together, that the male guards the nest from intruders, including often female intruders, that the male will also help in the rearing of the pups. It does not imply sexual exclusivity. And it doesn't even in birds that are long-term pair bonders, such as Canada geese. In any case, the question was asked in the 1980s, so we see this difference between montane voles and prairie voles. It's got to have to do with the brain. What's the difference in the brain? And Larry Young and a number of other people really went after this. And what this slide shows is the result of a lot of work, because there were many false starts here. And what you're looking at is a section of brain cut this way. And so you're going to see part of the reward system as well as part of the cortex. OTR means receptor for oxytocin, and V1AR means receptor for vasopressin. And these receptors are going to be stained, and so they will show up as dark. So in the prairie vole, in a very, very critical part of the reward system that modulates such things as positive affect, in the nucleus accumbens, you see quite dark staining for the receptor for oxytocin. And you see it also in a very distinct part of the reward system for vasopressin receptors, namely the ventral pallidum. And so it looks like it has to do with density of receptors in a very specific place. Interestingly, and I'll say more about this, this is the lateral septum. And notice that you have quite a density of receptors in the lateral septum for vasopressin. And that turns out to be a mark of non-social behavior. All right. So how then do we get to marmoset monkeys? Again, they tend to bond for life. The dads are wonderful. They even alloparent the neighbors' kids. How do we get to that? And it looks like there are a combination of things going on. Neurobiologically, there are probably small genetic changes that allow for feeling good and feeling appropriately trustworthy under certain circumstances. And one of those circumstances has to do with being groomed. And we now know, for example, that when monkeys groom one another or baboons groom one another, that has an effect in lowering stress hormones and increasing the levels of things like oxytocin and also, again, of course, the opioids. So in a certain sense, we're bonded to our friends somehow by circuitry that we don't all altogether understand, but also because it just feels good. And probably also, of course, an additional factor here is that when animals began to live in groups, certain other advantages accrued to them. They could cooperate in hunting. So if you are a wolf and you're trying to make it on your own, you're pretty much reduced to mice. Not great. I don't know whether you've ever really looked at what kind of a meal a mouse would constitute, but it's small. Whereas if you're in the group and you can engage in cooperative hunting, you can bring down deer or a caribou and so forth. And we know, again, from these wonderful studies in the wild that single baboons, single chimpanzees do not do well. And so it's advantageous for animals to have the kind of temperament, low stress hormones, the ability to tolerate other animals around you, and hence to be social. Now, in this slide, I felt I really had to show you some data slides, otherwise it would be kind of bad form. So here, Larry Young's lab was interested in the following question. So we see alloparenting by prairie vole siblings. And so he wanted to know, not all of them, some of them, well, they'd really rather play baseball. But some of them are very good. And so his question really was, what do their brains look like? And how do their brains compare to the brains of others that don't alloparent, such as meadow voles and mice? And again, you're staining for receptors for oxytocin. Rats actually, perhaps surprisingly, will alloparent also. The siblings will, take care of the young. And it takes them about 1 or 2 days of kind of hanging around and smelling them before they'll do it. But then they will do it. And then basically what you can see is in the nucleus accumbens, that critical reward center, but also in the caudate putamen, you see a high density of receptors in those prairie vole juveniles who will alloparent. You see some in rats, not in meadow voles, and not in mice. But the lateral septum in meadow voles turns out to have quite a significant density of receptors for oxytocin. Meadow voles are kind of interesting. We always thought that they were solitary because in the summertime they have their babies and they're by themselves. Turns out that in the wintertime they tend to live in groups of 10, 12, 14. I guess it's cold, and they huddle together, and they tend to make special friends in this huddling formation that they have. So Annalisa Beery asked the question, is there a seasonal change in the lateral septum? So in the lateral septum in the summer, you see a lot of oxytocin receptors, and they're solitary. They don't want anybody around. In the winter, those shut down, and you see the animals are quite social. And this has suggested that maybe being social in a mammal is the default. And if, given the ecological circumstances, you need to be solitary, you just pack the lateral septum with receptors for oxytocin, and the circuitry, whatever it is, and we do not know, will take care of the job. Okay, so that kind of addresses the first part of what Darwin was talking about, the social instinct, or what I like to think of as the social platform, the desire to be together, the feeling good when we are together, the feeling of anxiety when you're separated from your friends. But there's the part that involves skill, and it's very clear that many habits and conventions and practices, as I've suggested many times, are picked up by children in the process of development. And just as various other kinds of habits seem to be learned and handled by, if I may put it crudely, by the basal ganglia cortical loop, probably social conventions and norms are likewise handled. And really in this slide, I just really want to show you something about the nature of that loop. There's the nucleus accumbens, there's the ventral pallidum. There aren't direct connections between the basal ganglia and the cortex, but we know that the basal ganglia are extraordinarily important for somehow integrating what you learn with motivation. Okay, and I'll say a little bit more about that. This is just another picture, but also showing you that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, along with the cingulate cortex, is also an important part of that loopy system that is involved in learning habits and learning skills. Now, this is an old data slide. It's from Wolfram Schultz's famous paper in 1997, where he really kind of kicked off the work on the basal ganglia and on reinforcement learning, which hitherto had been studied very, very well and beautifully at the behavioral level, but not at the neural level. So Schultz was recording in the monkey in the region known in the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area, the VTA. And what you're looking at here are data slides where each one of these dots is a spike, and this is a histogram compounding those results. Nothing happens. The monkey's sort of sitting there in his chair, and then all of a sudden he gets a squirt of juice, right? He gets a reward here. And what you'll notice is an increase in activity right after that. So you do that a few times. And then because you're interested in reinforcement learning, you begin to pair it with a tone or whatever you want your conditioned stimulus to be. So now we go bong, and then we provide the reward. And after just a few trials, notice where the increase in activity is. It's not at the reward as it was in the beginning. Now the increase in activity is at the signal that the reward is coming. Now we test a slightly different condition. We produce the conditioned stimulus, bong, and we give him no reward. And notice what happens. The activity falls below baseline right here. Now, in and of itself, this only tells us that a learning signal is picked up in the VTA and propagated somewhere.
Am I right to see that there's a slight lag in the lower picture?
Slight lag in the sense that
Timing of the reduction of activity following the failure to get a reward?
yeah, I suppose it could be. Does that tell me I'm done? Or is that just your friends calling? Okay. So this inspired a huge amount of work, as I'm sure you know, on the nature of the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia have been studied anatomically to find out in great detail what the circuitry is, but also in the human context. So there have been lots and lots of scanning work. And this has also been important because the basal ganglia, the reward system structures, are the ones that are implicated in addiction. And so to get back to counterfactuals, there is a very particular region in the ventral striatum that gets rewarded when you make the correct prediction on the basis of some input. But there's another area that also will signal if, in looking back and thinking about it, you realize you should have made the other choice. And Montague was the first one, I think, to see this, and he calls it fictive error. And I wrote him off. Read, this is counterfactuals. That's what this is. And so it is a counterfactual, and it is a signal. But here's the kicker. So they did this experiment then with addicts, recovered addicts, who had been on cocaine or who had been on nicotine. And the ones who had been on cocaine were not terribly good at getting a reward in the ventral striatum when they should have done. It was not normal, but it was for the nicotine addicts. However, for the counterfactual signal, both of them were really bad. So if you're a smoker, you're not, according to these data at any rate, in this condition. You have compromised your capacity to respond appropriately to the counterfactual. To respond, in other words, to say, oh, I chose that, but I really should have chosen that. Okay. So now, just then to make a little bit more of the point about the importance of basal ganglia and the acquisition of norms, we know that sometimes norms are just picked up. Very often they involve a certain amount of teaching, but not a lot. but they causally affect the brain. And this kind of interests me because sometimes when people think about free will, they think, well, when I make a decision, it should be free of all causal antecedents. It just should be me creating my decision from nothing. And then we think about the acquisition of self-control in children or in adults, where we are positively exploiting the causality of the circuitry in the basal ganglia to achieve self-control. What do I mean by self-control? The usual 4 criteria are that you can maintain a goal despite distraction, that you can defer gratification when it's in your interest, that you can cancel an action once it's started, and finally that you can suppress impulses that are inappropriate. And for some of those, at least 3 of them, there are beautiful rat protocols that show that rats have very good self-control, or at least some rats do. As you would imagine, this is biology, so there's always variability. Some rats are pretty good, some rats not so good, and so on for counseling and action. And there's slightly different circuitry. This is also interesting. Slightly different circuitry, although overlapping, for counseling and action versus deferring gratification. So some rats who are terrific at deferring gratification are not so good at counseling and action. So they don't perfectly coincide. All right. Now, the reward system has often been viewed as really just a learning system, where you're learning to make an association, for example, between the tone and the onset of the juice reward. And so it's thought to be essentially this. But of course, we know that there must be a motivational aspect to it, or you wouldn't learn. And it turns out also that liking and wanting can be shown to come apart under certain conditions. This was the great work that was done by Kent Berridge and his colleagues at the University of Michigan. And when you first hear it, you think, oh, what do you mean? I mean, if I want it, then when I get it, I'm going to like it, right? Well, it turns out no. And sometimes we think we really want something, and when we get it, it's not what we had hoped. It's not as good as we thought. But, of course, his experiments are done on rats. They're very precise, and you can show exactly how wanting and liking come apart. And Kent thinks, and I believe he's right about this, that this also happens in addiction, is that we know that the hedonic effect of, let us say, cocaine, after the first few binges. So let's suppose this is the homeostatic point, and you binge on cocaine, you have a big hedonic effect and a small counter effect. You do that a few times. Now your hedonic effect is like this. Your counterpoint is like this. What is that counterpoint? Stress hormones. So part of the reason you feel bad is that you have a deeper and longer proliferation of stress hormones. That's why it's horrible. So then the cocaine addict wants to stop, but he wants the cocaine. When he gets it, what does it do for him? Now it really doesn't do anything. It just reduces a little bit the level of stress hormone until it stops, and then the level of stress hormone is deeper than ever before. So actually, cocaine is really bad. And it's bad even if you don't actually get addicted because of the horrible things that it does to your system. Ditto, in fact, for nicotine. Okay, I'm about to wind down. So my last slide. So one of the things that we have learned also in the case of animal research is that when there are sufficient resources, animals that are thought to be solitary actually enjoy a social life. Now, I mentioned this in the case of the meadow voles in the coldness of winter and how they like to huddle together. But it turns out that orangs, which we always think of as solitary, and indeed in the wild they are. And they are because they're vegetarians, and like bears, they each need a really big territory. So once the infant is old enough, the mother gives them the boots, and she's alone. This was a rescue center in Iowa. They had an orang. He kind of hung out by himself quite a bit until one day the dog came in. And it's very clear that there's some opioid action here. These guys really like to be together, and they are distressed when they are separated. Their stress hormones go up. And they show that kind of behavior that we know, that is the grooming behavior, that we know is productive of pleasure, that raises the level of opioids and the attachment to the mu opioids. I keep mentioning mu because it turns out that the kappa opioid receptors actually regulate negative feelings, so it's not the opium as such. And I think it also shows us something that we see in mammals, and we see this in birds certainly, that we do not see in social insects or social fish, and that is liking to be with another, even if there's no reproductive advantage in it. These guys are just enjoying it because that's the way their brains are configured. But there's nothing in this that is going to lead to a particular reproductive advantage for those individuals. Of course, for most of us, liking to be together, enjoying the company of others, and so forth, does have a very distinct advantage. Now, I'm sorry that I have had to go so fast over so much, but I wanted to give you a feeling for what the larger picture looks like, and not just sort of to focus on oxytocin receptors in the prairie vole in winter. Thank you.